Martha wiped the sweat from her forehead as she looked across the dry land that stretched endlessly before her small cabin. The summer of 1887 had been cruel to everyone in the Arizona Territory, but it seemed especially harsh to a woman trying to survive alone. Her husband Jacob had died 3 winters ago, leaving her with nothing but their small homestead, a few chickens, and Copper, her faithful chestnut mare. The drought had lasted 4 months now. The well behind her house had run dry 2 weeks ago, and she had to walk 3 miles each day to fetch water from the creek that still trickled weakly through the rocks. Her vegetable garden had withered away, leaving only brown stalks that crackled in the hot wind. The chickens had stopped laying eggs, and she had already eaten 2 of them just to survive. Martha was 42 years old, with graying brown hair that she kept tied back in a simple bun. Her hands were rough from years of hard work, and her blue dress had been patched so many times that it was more patches than original fabric. But her eyes still held the determination that had brought her and Jacob west from Missouri 15 years ago. Every morning, she would saddle Copper and ride to the small trading post 15 miles away, hoping someone might need her help in exchange for food or supplies. Sometimes she found work washing clothes or helping with cooking, but those opportunities were becoming rare. Everyone in the territory was struggling. On this particular morning, as she prepared to make the long ride to town, she heard something unusual. It sounded like moaning coming from somewhere beyond the small hill behind her house. She had lived on this land long enough to know every sound the wind made through the rocks and the sparse trees. This was different. This was human. Martha hesitated for a moment. The Apache had been mostly peaceful in recent years, but tension still ran high between the white settlers and the native tribes. Stories of raids and conflicts were common, though she had never personally experienced any trouble. Her husband had always taught her to judge people by their actions, not their appearance or background. The moaning came again, weaker this time. Someone was hurt, possibly dying. Martha made her decision quickly. She grabbed her water jug and a clean cloth and walked around the hill to investigate. What she found there shocked her. A young Apache man, probably in his 20s, lay crumpled against a large boulder. His long black hair was matted with blood, and his buckskin shirt was torn and stained red. His breathing was shallow and labored. Near him lay a magnificent black horse, also injured, with a deep gash across its flank. The man's eyes fluttered open as Martha approached. They were dark brown, filled with pain, but also with a surprising gentleness. He tried to speak, but only a weak whisper came out. Martha could not understand the Apache language, but she could see that he was asking for help. Without thinking about the possible consequences, Martha knelt beside him and carefully examined his wounds. There was a deep cut on his head, probably from a fall, and his left arm appeared to be broken. His lips were cracked from dehydration, and his skin was burning with fever. She gently lifted his head and gave him small sips of water from her jug. The Apache man's eyes showed gratitude as the cool liquid touched his lips. She then tore strips from her petticoat to clean his wounds as best she could. The injured horse whinnied softly nearby. Martha could see that it too was suffering from the heat and lack of water. She walked over to the animal and spoke to it in the same gentle voice she used with Copper. The horse allowed her to approach and examine its wound. Martha realized that both the man and the horse would die if they remained here in the blazing sun. The man was too heavy for her to carry alone, and she could not move the injured horse. She would need Coppa's help. She ran back to her cabin and quickly saddled her mare. Copper seemed to sense the urgency and stood perfectly still as Martha attached a rope to the saddle. She rode back to where the Apache man lay unconscious. Working carefully, Martha managed to fashion a simple travois using some fallen branches and her rope. It was not perfect, but it would allow Copper to drag the injured man to the shade near her cabin. The process took over an hour in the blazing heat, but finally, she had both the man and his horse near her home. She created a shelter using old blankets stretched between posts, providing shade for the Apache man. She gave him more water and continued to clean his wounds. The horse stood nearby, accepting the water and care she offered. As the afternoon wore on, Martha found herself talking to the unconscious man, even though she knew he could not understand her. She told him about her life, about Jacob, about the drought, and her struggles to survive. Speaking aloud seemed to make her feel less alone. The Apache man slipped in and out of consciousness throughout the day. Each time he woke, Martha gave him water and tried to make him more comfortable. She could see that he was young, with strong features and calloused hands that spoke of a life spent outdoors. Despite the stories she had heard about Apache warriors, this man seemed peaceful, even gentle. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Martha faced a difficult decision. The man needed medical attention that she could not provide. The nearest doctor was in town, 20 miles away. But she also knew that bringing an Apache man to the white settlement could cause serious trouble for both of them. She looked at Copper, her faithful mare who had been with her through every hardship since Jacob's death. The horse was strong and sure-footed, capable of making the difficult journey to town. But Martha also knew that if she took the Apache man to seek help, she might not make it back before he died. The injured horse had managed to stand and was slowly walking around, though it was clearly still in pain. Martha could see intelligence in its eyes and a bond between the animal and the man that reminded her of her relationship with Copper. As darkness began to fall, Martha made her decision. She would stay with the Apache man through the night and try to help him survive until morning. If he was still alive at sunrise, she would take him to town, regardless of the consequences. She built a small fire and prepared a simple meal from her remaining supplies. The Apache man woke several times during the night. Each time accepting the water she offered with grateful eyes. She could see that his fever was beginning to break, which gave her hope. Martha spent the long night keeping watch over her unexpected patient. She had no idea that this decision would change not only his life, but her own in ways she could never have imagined. The morning sun would bring more than just a new day. It would bring the beginning of an extraordinary bond between two very different people, united by compassion and the basic human need to help one another survive in a harsh and unforgiving land. Martha woke at dawn to find the Apache man sitting up, leaning against the post that supported his makeshift shelter. His dark eyes were clear now, no longer clouded by fever and pain. He was examining the bandages she had wrapped around his head and arm, his expression thoughtful rather than suspicious. When he noticed her stirring, he spoke softly in his own language. Though Martha could not understand the words, his tone was clearly one of gratitude. He pointed to himself and said something that sounded like Running Wolf. Then he pointed to her with a questioning look. "Martha," she said, touching her chest. "Martha Jenkins." He repeated her name carefully, his accent making it sound different, but respectful. "Martha." Then he pointed to his injured horse, which was grazing nearby on the sparse grass around her cabin. "Thunderfoot," he said in English, surprising her with his knowledge of her language. Over the next few hours, Martha discovered that Running Wolf understood much more English than he initially let on. He had learned it during previous encounters with traders and soldiers, though he spoke it haltingly. Through a combination of simple English, gestures, and patience, they began to communicate. Running Wolf explained that he had been riding alone, scouting for water sources for his band, when Thunderfoot had stepped in a prairie dog hole. Both horse and rider had tumbled down a rocky slope. He had been unconscious for nearly a day before Martha found him. "Why you help?" he asked her directly, his dark eyes searching her face. It was a fair question. Most white settlers would have either fled in fear or perhaps even left him to die. Martha thought about her answer carefully. "Because you needed help?" she finally said. "Jacob, my husband, he always said that kindness has no color." Running Wolf nodded slowly, seeming to understand not just her words, but the deeper meaning behind them. He looked around at her small homestead, taking in the dried-up garden, the meager supplies, the general air of someone struggling to survive. "You have little," he observed, "but you share." Martha shrugged, feeling suddenly embarrassed by his gratitude. "We all need help sometimes." As the day progressed, Running Wolf proved to be a helpful patient. Despite his injuries, he insisted on doing what he could to help around the homestead. He showed her how to set a trap for rabbits using materials she had never thought to use. He also demonstrated a technique for finding water by observing the flight patterns of birds and the behavior of insects. His horse, Thunderfoot, seemed to be recovering well. The gash on its flank was healing cleanly, and the animal showed no signs of serious injury beyond the original wound. Running Wolf spent much of his time talking softly to the horse and Apache, his hands gentle as he checked the makeshift bandages Martha had applied. On the second day of his recovery, Running Wolf made an observation that surprised Martha. "You have good horse," he said, nodding toward Copper. "Strong spirit. But she is alone like you." Martha looked at her mare, grazing peacefully near Thunderfoot. It was true that Copper had been her only companion since Jacob's death. The horse had been faithful and dependable, carrying her through every hardship. "Copper is all I have left," Martha admitted. "When Jacob died, I sold everything else to pay his debts. She is the only thing of value I still own." Running Wolf was quiet for a long moment, studying both Martha and her horse. "Value," he repeated slowly. "What is value of life?" It was a profound question that made Martha think. She had always measured value in practical terms since Jacob's death, in terms of what could be sold or traded for survival. But Running Wolf seemed to be talking about something deeper. On the third day, as Running Wolf's strength continued to return, he began to move around more freely. He helped Martha repair a section of her fence that had been damaged by the wind, using techniques that were far more effective than her own attempts. He also showed her how to prepare a medicinal tea from plants that grew wild around her property, plants she had never paid attention to before. "Your land has much medicine," he told her as they sat by the fire that evening. "But you must know where to look." Martha realized that despite living on this land for years, she had learned to see it only as Jacob had taught her to see it, through the eyes of farming and settlement. Running Wolf saw it differently, as a living system where everything was connected and everything had purpose. "How do you know so much about healing?" she asked him. "My grandmother," he replied with a smile that transformed his usually serious face. "She taught me many things. Plants, animals, the language of the earth. She said wisdom is like water. It flows where it is needed." Martha found herself looking forward to their conversations. Running Wolf had a way of seeing the world that was both practical and profound. He spoke of his people with deep respect, describing a way of life that seemed harsh, but also rich with tradition and meaning. On the fourth day, Running Wolf announced that he was strong enough to travel. His wounds had healed remarkably well under Martha's care, and Thunderfoot was moving without difficulty. "I must return to my people," he said. "They will be worried." Martha felt a surprising sadness at the thought of his departure. His presence had brought a kind of life to her small homestead that had been missing since Jacob's death. But she understood his need to return to his family. "Of course," she said. "They must be wondering what happened to you." Running Wolf was packing his few belongings when he paused and looked at Martha seriously. "You have given me my life," he said. "This is a debt that must be repaid." "You don't owe me anything," Martha protested. "I just did what anyone should do." But Running Wolf shook his head. "Among my people, a life debt is sacred. It must be honored." That evening, as they shared what would be their last meal together, Running Wolf asked Martha about her struggles. With surprising openness, she told him about the drought, about her failing attempts to make the homestead productive, about her dwindling supplies, and her fears for the coming winter. "I will probably have to sell Copper soon," she admitted, the words painful to speak aloud. "She's the only thing I have that anyone would want to buy. But without her," she did not finish the sentence, but they both understood what it would mean. Without Copper, Martha would have no way to travel to town for supplies or work. She would be completely isolated. Running Wolf listened without speaking, his face grave as he considered her situation. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. "There may be another way," he said finally. "But it would require great trust." "What do you mean?" "Give me copper," he said quietly. "Let me take her with me when I leave tomorrow." Martha's heart sank. She had expected his gratitude, but not this. "I told you, I don't need payment." "Not payment," Running Wolf interrupted. "Trust. Give me your horse, and in 3 days, when the sun rises, come to the place where you found me. Come alone." Martha stared at him in confusion. "I don't understand." "Trust," he repeated simply. "Sometimes it is all we have." Martha lay awake most of that night, staring at the ceiling of her small cabin and wrestling with Running Wolf's request. Give him copper? The mare was literally her lifeline, her only means of survival in this harsh land. Without the horse, she could not travel to town for supplies or work. She would be completely stranded. Yet something in Running Wolf's eyes when he made the request had stopped her from refusing immediately. There had been no deception there, no hint of trickery, just an earnest conviction that she should trust him with the most valuable thing she possessed. When morning came, Martha walked outside to find Running Wolf already awake, sitting quietly beside the dying embers of their fire. Thunderfoot stood nearby, saddled and ready for travel. The Apache man looked up at her with patient eyes, waiting for her decision. "You are asking me to give up everything," Martha said quietly. "I'm asking you to trust," Running Wolf replied. "In my tribe, we have a saying. Sometimes we must let go of what we hold tight in order to receive what we truly need." Martha looked at Copper, who was grazing peacefully in the early morning light. The mare had been with her through every hardship, every lonely day and difficult night since Jacob's death. How could she just hand over the reins to a man she had known for only 4 days? But then she remembered Running Wolf's gentleness with Thunderfoot, the way he spoke to the injured horse with such care and understanding. She thought about his knowledge of healing plants, his skillful work on her fence, his profound way of seeing the world around them. This was not a man who would betray trust lightly. 3 days? She asked. "You promise you will be at the place where I found you in 3 days?" "When the sun rises on the 3rd day," Running Wolf confirmed. "I give you my word." In Apache culture, Martha had learned during their conversations, one's word was sacred. To break a promise was to lose one's honor completely. Looking into Running Wolf's steady gaze, she made her decision. With trembling hands, she led Copper over to where Running Wolf waited. The mare seemed to sense something significant was happening and nuzzled Martha's shoulder affectionately. Martha buried her face in the horse's mane for a moment, breathing in the familiar scent of her oldest friend. "Take care of her," she whispered to Running Wolf as she handed him the reins. "She will be safe," he promised. Then, in a gesture that surprised her, he reached into his pack and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Medicine plants," he explained, placing it in her hands. "If you feel weak or sick, make tea from the leaves inside. Use only a small amount." Running Wolf mounted Thunderfoot with the fluid grace of someone who had spent his life on horseback. Kappa's reins were tied to his saddle, and the mare followed docilely as he guided Thunderfoot away from the homestead. At the top of the small rise, Running Wolf turned back one more time. He raised his hand in farewell, and Martha raised hers in return. Then he was gone, disappearing into the vast expanse of desert and rock that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Martha stood alone in front of her cabin, feeling more isolated than she had ever felt in her life. The silence seemed overwhelming. Without Kappa's occasional whinnying or the sound of her hooves on the hard ground, the homestead felt completely dead. The first day passed slowly. Martha tried to keep busy by cleaning her cabin thoroughly, mending clothes, and organizing her meager supplies. But every few minutes, she found herself looking toward the horizon, half expecting to see Running Wolf returning with Copper. By evening, doubt had begun to creep into her mind. What if she had been foolish? What if Running Wolf had simply taken advantage of her kindness? The second day was worse. Martha's water supply was running dangerously low, and without Copper, she had no way to travel to the creek 3 miles away. She rationed herself to tiny sips, hoping the small amount would last until Running Wolf returned. If he returned, she found herself thinking about Jacob and what he would have said about her decision. Her husband had been a practical man, someone who believed in helping others, but also in protecting what was his. Would he have thought her brave or foolish? As the sun set on the second day, Martha's fear was mixed with anger. How could she have been so naive? She had given away her only hope of survival to a man she barely knew, based on nothing more than a feeling and a few days of conversation. That night, she barely slept at all. She kept listening for the sound of hooves, hoping against hope that Running Wolf had decided to return early. But the night remained silent except for the endless whisper of whine through the rocks. The third day dawned clear and bright. Martha forced herself to eat a small breakfast, though her stomach was twisted with anxiety. She dressed carefully in her cleanest dress and braided her hair neatly. If this was to be her last day of hope, she wanted to face it with dignity. The walk to the place where she had found Running Wolf seemed much longer on foot. Without Copper, Martha had to pick her way carefully over the rocky ground, and the heat of the morning sun was already making her feel dizzy. Her water had run out the night before, and she was beginning to feel the effects of dehydration. When she finally reached the boulder where Running Wolf had lain injured, Martha sat down heavily on a nearby rock. The sun was climbing steadily toward its peak, and there was no sign of anyone approaching. She tried to remain calm, but panic was beginning to set in. Had she been wrong about Running Wolf? Had she misread the sincerity in his eyes, the honor in his words? Martha found herself wondering if she would even be able to make it back to her cabin in her weakened state. She was just beginning to consider starting the long walk home when she heard something that made her heart skip. It was faint at first, almost lost in the sound of the wind. But as it grew closer, there was no mistaking it. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, moving fast across the desert floor. Martha stood up shakily, shading her eyes with her hand as she peered toward the horizon. A cloud of dust was approaching from the direction Running Wolf had taken 3 days before. As it drew nearer, she could make out the shapes of horses and riders. Her heart pounded as the group came closer. At the front, mounted on Thunderfoot, was Running Wolf. Behind him rode several other Apache men, and behind them, Martha's breath caught in her throat. Behind the riders came a herd of horses unlike any she had ever seen. Wild Mustangs, their coats gleaming in the morning sun, their manes flowing free in the desert wind. There were at least 20 of them, maybe more, moving with the grace and power that only truly free horses possessed. And there, running easily among the wild herd, was Copper. Running Wolf dismounted as he reached Martha, his face serious but his eyes bright with satisfaction. "You trusted," he said simply. "Now you will see why." The other Apache riders formed a wide circle around the herd of Mustangs, keeping them contained but not frightened. Martha could see that these were skilled horsemen, working together with the kind of coordination that came from years of partnership. "I do not understand," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. Running Wolf smiled then, the first time she had seen him truly happy. "Your mare," he said, nodding toward Copper. "She is what my people call a leader horse. She has the spirit that other horses follow. We used her to bring these Mustangs down from the high country." Martha stared in amazement as she began to understand. "You mean, these horses have no owners?" Running Wolf continued. "They are free, but they need good land and water to survive. Your land has both, if you know how to find them. And now you have horses that can work your land, carry your burdens, and give you what you need to trade in town." One of the other Apache men, an older warrior with gray in his hair, approached them. Running Wolf spoke to him in their language, and the man nodded respectfully to Martha. "My uncle, Gray Eagle," Running Wolf explained. "He says you have the face of one who understands the value of life over gold. He thinks these horses will be happy on your land." Martha looked around at the magnificent animals milling restlessly in the circle formed by the Apache riders. These were not gentle farm horses like Copper, but wild creatures full of fire and independence. "How could I ever manage them?" she asked. "Copper will teach them," Running Wolf said confidently. "And I will teach you. If you wish it, I will stay for a while to help you learn their ways. My people do not need me immediately, and I have not yet repaid my debt to you." Martha felt tears starting in her eyes. "This is too much," she said. "I cannot accept." "You gave me my life," Running Wolf interrupted gently. "Now I give yours back. These horses can carry you to town, help you work your land, and some can be traded for the things you need. You will never have to sell copper now." As if hearing her name, the chestnut mare broke away from the herd and trotted over to Martha, nickering softly. Martha threw her arms around Kappa's neck, breathing in the familiar scent and feeling the solid warmth of her friend. But even as she embraced her horse, Martha's eyes were drawn back to the wild Mustangs. They were beautiful beyond description, but they were also clearly powerful and potentially dangerous. Learning to work with them would be the challenge of a lifetime. "Are you certain they will stay?" she asked Running Wolf. "With good grass, water, and proper treatment, yes," he replied. "But it will not be easy. Wild horses do not become tame quickly. It takes patience, understanding, and respect." Martha looked at Running Wolf, then at the horses, then back at Running Wolf. The magnitude of what was being offered to her was almost overwhelming. A few days ago, she had been prepared to sell her only horse just to survive the winter. Now she was being offered a herd that could change her entire life. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you do all this for someone you barely know?" Running Wolf was quiet for a moment, watching the Mustangs move restlessly in their circle. "Because," he said finally, "sometimes the spirits put people in our path not by accident, but by design. You saved my life without thought for the danger to yourself. Perhaps this is how the world balances itself." Martha felt a profound shift happening inside her, as if her entire understanding of what was possible was expanding. She had thought her choice was between keeping copper and selling her. She had never imagined a third option, one that came from trusting a virtual stranger and believing in the possibility of something greater than what she could see. "I accept," she said quietly. Then, louder, "I accept your gift and your help in learning to care for them." Running Wolf's smile was like sunrise breaking over the desert. "Then, let us begin," he said. "There is much to learn, and the horses are eager to see their new home." The journey back to Martha's homestead was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The wild Mustangs moved as a living river of muscle and spirit, their hooves drumming a rhythm on the hard desert floor. Running Wolf and the other Apache riders guided them with subtle signals and positioning, never forcing but always directing. Martha rode Copper beside Running Wolf, watching in amazement as the herd responded to the slightest movements of the riders. These men understood horses in a way she had never imagined possible. They seemed to speak to the animals without words, communicating through posture, breath, and an almost mystical connection that transcended ordinary understanding. "How do you do it?" she asked Running Wolf as they paused to rest at a small waterhole. The Mustangs spread out to drink, their movements graceful despite their obvious wildness. "We do not control them," Running Wolf explained. "We join them. There is a difference. To control is to fight. To join is to become part of the herd yourself." Martha watched as Gray Eagle, Running Wolf's uncle, moved slowly among the horses. The animals acknowledged his presence, but showed no fear. He touched several of them gently, examining their condition with the experienced eye of someone who had spent a lifetime working with horses. "That stallion," Gray Eagle said in careful English, pointing to a magnificent black horse with a white blaze on its forehead. "He is the true leader. The others follow him, not us. We must earn his respect, or the herd will leave." Martha looked at the stallion, who stood slightly apart from the others, his head high and alert. Even from a distance, she could see the intelligence in his eyes and the power in his stance. He was beautiful, but also intimidating. "What if he decides he does not want to stay on my land?" she asked. "Then he will leave," Running Wolf answered honestly, "and probably take most of the herd with him. This is why we must be very careful in the next few weeks. These horses are giving us a chance to prove ourselves. We must not waste it. When they reached Martha's homestead, the Mustangs spread out across her property, exploring with curious but cautious movements. Several of them went immediately to the small creek that flowed behind her cabin, while others began testing the grass in various spots. The black stallion, whom Running Wolf called Shadow because of his dark coat and elusive nature, positioned himself on a small rise where he could observe both the herd and the surrounding area. His watchfulness was constant and intelligent. "He is deciding whether this place is safe," Running Wolf explained. "Everything depends on his judgment." Over the next few days, Martha began to understand just how much her life was about to change. The Apache men had brought supplies and tools she had never seen before. They constructed a simple but effective corral using fallen trees and natural rock formations. They also showed her how to build a shelter that would provide protection for the horses during storms while still allowing them the freedom they needed. But most importantly, they began to teach her the complex art of working with wild horses. "Forget everything you think you know about horses," Running Wolf told her on the first morning. "Copper is a good horse, but she has lived among humans all her life. These Mustangs have never known captivity. They think differently." Martha's first lesson was simply to sit quietly near the herd and observe. For hours, she watched the horses interact with each other, noting the subtle ways they communicated. The stallion Shadow was clearly the leader, but there's also a hierarchy among the Mares, with an older gray horse serving as what Running Wolf called the lead mare. "The stallion protects," Running Wolf explained, "but the lead mare decides where the herd goes, when they drink, when they rest. Both kinds of leadership are necessary." Martha began to see patterns in the horses' behavior that she had never noticed before. The way they positioned themselves when resting, always keeping one or two animals alert for danger. The way they groomed each other, strengthening social bonds. The way the young horses played together, learning skills they would need as adults. "They are like a family," she observed to Running Wolf. "Yes," he agreed. "And if you want to work with them, you must become part of that family. Not the leader, not the master. Just a member who has earned her place." The process was far more difficult than Martha had imagined. Her first attempts to approach the Mustangs were met with suspicion and flight. The horses would allow her to come within 30 feet or so, then would move away as a group, always keeping that safe distance. "You are trying too hard," Running Wolf told her after a particularly frustrating morning. "They can smell your anxiety, your eagerness. To them, that feels like the behavior of a predator." "Then, how do I approach them?" "Do not approach them. Let them approach you." This advice seemed impossible at first. How could she let the horses come to her if they always moved away when she got near? But Running Wolf showed her techniques that his people had developed over generations of working with wild horses. First, he taught her to control her breathing and posture. "Stand like a tree," he said. "Strong but not threatening. Present but not demanding." Martha practiced standing in the pasture while the horses grazed nearby, focusing on becoming as peaceful and non-threatening as possible. It was surprisingly difficult. Her natural instinct was to move toward the horses, to try to initiate contact. Learning to simply be present and wait required a kind of patience she had never developed. After 3 days of this exercise, something remarkable happened. Martha was standing quietly near the small creek when one of the younger horses, a bay mare with a white sock on her front leg, began to graze slowly in her direction. The mare did not look at Martha directly, but she came closer and closer until she was only a few feet away. Martha remained perfectly still, barely breathing. The young mare raised her head and looked at her directly for the first time. For a moment, their eyes met, and Martha felt a connection that was completely different from anything she had experienced with Copper. This was not the trusting relationship of a domestic horse, but something wilder and more electric. Then, the mare lowered her head and continued grazing, now comfortable with Martha's presence. "Good," Running Wolf said quietly from where he had been watching nearby. "She has accepted you as non-threatening. This is the first step." Over the following weeks, Martha's education in wild horse behavior continued. She learned to read the subtle signals that indicated when a horse was relaxed, nervous, curious, or preparing to bolt. She learned to move with smooth, predictable motions that would not startle the animals. Most importantly, she learned to think like a horse rather than like a human. Horses live in the present moment, Running Wolf explained. They do not worry about yesterday or tomorrow. They respond to what is happening right now. This is why consistency is so important. They must learn to predict your behavior, just as you learn to predict theirs. Gray Eagle proved to be an excellent teacher as well. The older Apache man had a gift for understanding horses that seemed almost supernatural. He could predict which horse would be ready to accept human contact next, and which ones needed more time. He also began to teach Martha practical skills like identifying signs of illness or injury in the herd. "This mare," he said one morning, pointing to a chestnut horse standing slightly apart from the others, "she favors her right front foot. Small stone, probably. We must check." Martha watched in fascination as Gray Eagle approached the injured mare, using a series of gentle movements and soft vocalizations. The horse allowed him to examine her hoof and remove a sharp stone that had become lodged there. The entire process took less than 5 minutes, but it demonstrated a level of trust between human and horse that Martha was still striving to achieve. Meanwhile, the practical aspects of caring for the herd were becoming clearer. The Mustangs required different food than domestic horses, preferring the native grasses and plants that grew wild on Martha's property. Running Wolf showed her how to identify which plants were nutritious and which might be harmful. He also taught her about water management. The small creek that flowed through her property could support the herd during most of the year, but during dry periods, she would need to supplement it with additional sources. "This is why your land is perfect for them," he explained. "Most places around here do not have reliable water, but you must learn to manage it carefully, especially during drought." Martha began to understand that accepting the gift of these horses also meant accepting a huge responsibility. She would need to learn skills that most settlers never developed, and she would need to think about land management in ways that were completely foreign to traditional farming. But as the days passed, she also began to see the rewards. The horses brought life to her property in ways she had never expected. Their presence transformed the empty, struggling homestead into something vibrant and dynamic. More importantly, caring for them gave her a sense of purpose that had been missing since Jacob's death. The breakthrough in her relationship with the herd came on a hot afternoon in late summer. Martha was sitting in the shade near the corral when Shadow, the black stallion who had remained aloof from all human contact, walked slowly in her direction. Martha forced herself to remain completely still as the powerful horse approached. Shadow stopped about 10 feet away and studied her with intelligent dark eyes. For several long minutes, neither moved. Then, to Martha's amazement, Shadow took several steps closer. The stallion extended his neck toward her, nostrils flaring as he caught her scent. Martha remained frozen, hardly daring to breathe. Shadow moved closer still, until his muzzle was only inches from her face. For a moment that seemed to last forever, the wild stallion and the lonely woman looked directly into each other's eyes. Martha felt as if Shadow was looking into her soul, weighing her character and finding her acceptable. Then, Shadow touched her cheek gently with his nose, a gesture so tender and unexpected that tears sprang to Martha's eyes. The stallion held the contact for several seconds before stepping back and walking calmly away. "Now you are truly part of the herd," Running Wolf said softly from where he had been watching. "Shadow has given you his approval. The others will follow his lead." Martha wiped the tears from her eyes, overwhelmed by the significance of what had just happened. In accepting the touch of the wild stallion, she felt as if she had crossed some invisible threshold into a new understanding of what was possible between humans and animals. That evening, as she and Running Wolf sat by their campfire watching the horses graze peacefully in the moonlight, Martha reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few short weeks. "I never imagined anything like this," she said quietly. "A month ago, I was ready to sell copper just to survive. Now I have a herd of wild horses and knowledge I never dreamed of possessing. Running Wolf nodded thoughtfully. The spirits work in mysterious ways, he said. Sometimes what seems like our greatest misfortune leads to our greatest blessing. Martha looked at the horses moving like shadows in the silver light, and knew that her life had been transformed in ways that went far beyond mere survival. She had found not just security, but purpose, not just a way to live, but a reason to thrive. But she also knew that the real test was yet to come. Winter was approaching, and with it would come challenges that would determine whether her newfound partnership with the wild horses could survive the harsh realities of life in the desert. As autumn approached, Running Wolf began making preparations to return to his people. The Apache band would be moving to their winter camp in the high country, and his extended absence was already causing concern among his family. The horses are settled now, he explained to Martha as they watched the herd grazing peacefully in the early morning light. Shadow trusts you, and the others follow his lead. You no longer need me to guide you. Martha felt a familiar pang of loss at the thought of Running Wolf's departure, similar to what she had experienced when Jacob died, but different. This was not the devastating grief of losing a life partner, but rather the bittersweet sadness of seeing a dear friend move on to the next phase of his journey. Over the months they had worked together, she had come to value not just Running Wolf's knowledge of horses, but his wisdom about life itself. His way of seeing the world had opened her eyes to possibilities she had never imagined. Through his teaching, she had learned to read the subtle languages of wind and weather, to understand the complex relationships between all living things on the land. "Will I see you again?" she asked. "When the seasons turn and my people return to this area, I will visit," he promised. "And if you ever have great need, send word through the trading post. Someone will carry the message to my band." Before he left, Running Wolf spent several days ensuring that Martha was fully prepared to manage the herd on her own. He reviewed everything he had taught her about horse behavior, health care, and the seasonal changes she could expect. "In winter, the horses will need more food," he reminded her. "They will eat the bark from certain trees when the grass is covered by snow. But be careful which trees you allow them strip. Some bark is medicine, but other kind can make them sick." He also helped her establish better relationships with some of the horses who had remained more aloof. A young pinto stallion named Storm had been particularly resistant to human contact, but Running Wolf worked patiently with both the horse and Martha until Storm would accept her presence without anxiety. "Every horse has a different personality," Running Wolf explained. "Storm is naturally suspicious, but he is also very intelligent. Once he truly trusts you, he will be one of your most reliable partners." On Running Wolf's last morning at the homestead, he and Martha sat together watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of gold and red. The horses were beginning to stir, some already moving toward the creek for their morning drink. "I have something for you," Running Wolf said, reaching into his pack. He pulled out a beautifully crafted leather halter, decorated with intricate beadwork in patterns of blue, red, and white. "My grandmother made this many years ago," he explained as he handed it to Martha. "She said it would find its way to someone who truly understood the spirit of horses. I think she meant you." Martha ran her fingers over the smooth leather and the tiny, perfect beads. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, but more than that, she could feel the love and care that had gone into its creation. "I cannot accept something so precious," she protested. "You must," Running Wolf insisted gently. "It belongs to someone who honors the relationship between human and horse. That is you now." When Running Wolf finally rode away on Thunderfoot, Martha stood watching until he disappeared beyond the horizon. Then she turned back to the herd that was now her responsibility and her joy. The first winter with the Mustangs proved to be both challenging and rewarding. Martha had to learn new skills almost daily, from treating a mare's infected hoof to helping a young horse who had gotten tangled in some old wire fencing. But with each challenge she overcame, her confidence and her bond with the horses grew stronger. The harsh winter months also revealed the horses' remarkable ability to take care of themselves when given proper respect and space. They knew instinctively how to find shelter during storms, how to paw through snow to reach grass underneath, and how to conserve energy during the coldest days. Martha found herself developing an almost supernatural awareness of the herd's needs and moods. She could tell when a storm was approaching by the way the horses positioned themselves. She learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when one of them was not feeling well or when potential danger was near. In the spring, Martha received her first real test of the trust she had built with the herd. A group of horse traders passing through the area offered to buy several of the Mustangs, promising prices that would have solved all of Martha's financial problems. "Those are fine animals," the lead trader said as he examined Shadow and several of the other horses. "We could give you enough money to live comfortably for years." Martha looked at the horses, then at the men who wanted to buy them. She thought about her empty bank account, her aging cabin, her uncertain future. Selling even half the herd would give her security for the rest of her life. But as she watched Shadow watching the strangers, she saw the tension in his posture, the way his ears flicked nervously. The stallion had learned to trust her, but these men represented everything he had spent his life avoiding. To sell him, or any of the others, would be a betrayal of the sacred bond they had formed. "They're not for sale," Martha told the traders firmly. "Any of them." The men tried to persuade her, offering even higher prices, but Martha's decision was final. As she watched them ride away, she felt a sense of rightness that was worth more than any amount of money. That spring also brought an unexpected visitor. Martha was working in her newly expanded garden when she heard the sound of approaching hooves. She looked up to see Running Wolf riding toward her on Thunderfoot, but he was not alone. A young Apache woman rode beside him, along with an older woman who could only be Running Wolf's grandmother. "Martha," Running Wolf called out as he dismounted, "I want you to meet my family." The young woman, who Running Wolf introduced as a sister, Morningstar, spoke excellent English and had brought gifts of food and beautiful pottery. But it was the grandmother, a tiny woman with snow-white hair and eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of the ages, who made the strongest impression. "She wishes to see the horses," Morningstar translated as the elderly woman spoke in Apache. "She says she dreamed of them and must know if they are the ones from her vision." Martha led the family to where the herd was grazing. The grandmother walked slowly among the horses, who showed no fear of her presence. She stopped in front of Shadow and spoke to him in the same gentle voice Running Wolf used. The stallion lowered his head, allowing her to touch his forehead. The old woman smiled and spoke rapidly to Running Wolf, who translated for Martha. "She says these are indeed the horses from her dreams," he explained. She dreamed that wild horses would find a home with a woman whose heart was strong enough to hold both grief and joy. She says the spirits are pleased with what has happened here. The grandmother then approached Martha and took her hands, speaking directly to her in Apache. Though Martha could not understand the words, she felt the blessing and approval in the woman's touch. "She wants to give you an Apache name," Morningstar explained. "She will call you She Who Speaks with Horses." "It is a great honor." That evening, as Running Wolf's family prepared to return to their camp, the grandmother presented Martha with a beautiful necklace made of silver and turquoise. "She made this for you," Running Star explained. "She says it will help you remember that you are part of two worlds now, the world of your birth and the world of the horses. Both are necessary for your spirit to be complete." After Running Wolf's family departed, Martha reflected on how profoundly her life had changed. She was no longer the desperate widow who had been ready to sell her last possession just to survive. She had become something she never could have imagined, a keeper of wild horses, a bridge between two cultures, a woman who had learned to speak the ancient language of trust and respect. The Mustangs had brought her far more than security or companionship. They had brought her a new understanding of her place in the world, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. As summer progressed, Word of Martha's success with the wild horses began to spread throughout the territory. Other settlers came to ask her advice about working with difficult horses. Some of the Apache bands began to include her homestead as a regular stop during their travels, knowing they would find water, grass for their horses, and a welcome from someone who understood their ways. Martha's property became a unique place in the frontier landscape, a spot where two cultures met in peace and mutual respect. She learned bits of the Apache language, and some of the Apache visitors learned English from her. Trading relationships developed that benefited everyone involved. The horses themselves seemed to thrive in this environment of cross-cultural exchange. They had learned to accept Apache visitors as easily as they accepted Martha, and several of the young horses born on her land showed an unusual friendliness toward humans that suggested they were developing into a new kind of horse, wild but cooperative. 1 year after Running Wolf had first brought the Mustangs to her land, Martha stood looking out over her thriving property as the sun set behind the distant mountains. The herd had grown, with several foals born during the spring. Her cabin had been expanded and improved. Her gardens were productive, irrigated by a system Running Wolf had helped her design. But, most importantly, she was no longer alone. The horses had become her family, each with its own personality and role in her life. Shadow remained the magnificent leader, but he had also become her most trusted companion. The bay mare who had first approached her was now gentle enough to be ridden, though she retained her wild independence. Storm, the suspicious pinto, had become an excellent guard horse, alerting the herd to any potential dangers. Copper, her original horse, had adapted beautifully to life with the wild herd. She served as a bridge between the domestic and wild worlds, helping Martha communicate with the Mustangs while enjoying the freedom of running with the herd. As Martha watched the horses moving peacefully in the gathering dusk, she thought about the choice she had made that sunrise morning when Running Wolf had asked her to trust him with her most precious possession. At the time, it had seemed like an impossible leap of faith. Now she understood that it had been the most important decision of her life. She had given up security and received abundance. She had surrendered control and found true partnership. She had risked everything and gained more than she had ever dared to dream. The trust she had shown a wounded Apache man had returned to her multiplied beyond measure. The wild horses had brought her not just prosperity, but purpose. They had transformed her from a struggling survivor into someone who contributed something valuable and unique to the world around her. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Martha walked among the horses, speaking to each one in the gentle voice Running Wolf had taught her to use. They acknowledged her presence with soft wickers and gentle touches, welcoming her as a beloved member of their family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. There would be foals to tend, horses to train, visitors to welcome, and always the endless, rewarding work of maintaining the delicate balance between wildness and cooperation that made her unique partnership with the Mustangs possible. But tonight, Martha was content to simply be present among the horses she had learned to love, grateful for the unexpected path her life had taken, and amazed by the way trust and kindness could transform the world in ways that seemed impossible until they happened. The circle that had begun with her act of compassion toward a wounded stranger was now complete. But like all the best circles, it also marked the beginning of something new, something that would continue to grow and expand, touching more lives and creating more connections than she could possibly imagine. In the distance, a coyote called to the moon, and the horses raised their heads to listen. Martha listened too, hearing in that wild sound the voice of the land itself, welcoming her home to a place she had never expected to find but had always been meant to discover.